the most out-of-touch thing you heard from rich people? Story 1. Living outside Jackson Hole, this sister of a friend told me how hard it is to live there. You have to fly in your help cleaning, yard work from Salt Lake. I had no words. Story 2. A coworker asked me what bank I used for my safe deposit box. I said I didn't have a safe deposit box. She said, "But where do you keep your jewels then?" Edit. I said I didn't have any jewels and she just said, "Huh," and changed the subject. I actually get the sentiment if I owned anything expensive, I would probably also have a safe place for it. But something about it made her sound like a Disney villain, even though she was a very nice person. It's a very vivid random memory. Thanks, OP. Story 3. Being told by a guy who has not worked a day in his life and living off of inherited money that poor people are poor because they don't invest their money, right? Story 4. While working for a valet parking service in the Santa Barbara area years ago, a woman hired us for a jewelry showing she was having at her giant house in Montecito. And while we were waiting for guests to arrive, my boss informed me that when the guests get in their cars to leave, that I needed to be sure to close their car doors or else they would just drive off with their doors open, as they're so used to people closing their car doors for them. Story 5. I needed a bicycle to get to a new job. Found someone online selling a really nice bike for cheap, so got in touch. Took 2 trains to their house to buy the bike, and when I got there, it was a mansion. The bike was in a garage full of supercars and classics. They asked me where my truck was to load the bike on. When I told them I was riding the bike home, they laughed. And before I knew it, everyone in the house had been called to the garage to hear how I was riding the bike 3 hours home in the dark. No one offered me a lift. They just acted blessed at how they didn't have to do such things. Story 6. Back when I was in my early 20s, my beat-up old car broke down in my job's parking lot when I was about to drive home. I was getting paid $10 an hour as a pastry chef at a catering company. This was barely enough to cover my rent. I was obviously pretty distraught over my car dying. My boss company owner ended up saying to me, "Why are you so upset? It's just a car. Just buy another one." I couldn't even respond. I just looked at her like she was crazy. Story 7. How could your family accountant let that happen? When talking about how growing up, we couldn't pay the bills and had our water electricity shut off multiple times. Story 8. My boss at the time made between 5-10x more than I did. We were talking about big purchases like a car or house, and he says something along the lines of, "Well, you'll get a great deal since you'd all cash purchaser." I just kind of smile and nod, knowing that, on my salary that he was aware of, I was not even an all-cash purchaser of groceries. Story 9. I work for a startup based out of San Francisco. I'm a remote employee halfway across the country, and am therefore a sort of second-class citizen. My direct peers who work in SF make at least double what I do, and they almost all had extremely privileged upbringings. They went to top 10 business schools. They summer in Tahoe, that kind of thing. I was in the home office a few months ago for our annual kickoff meeting, and one of the speakers polled the room. "Has anyone here worked at Amazon?" Nobody raised their hand. Wow, I'm surprised. I said, "Does warehouse count?" And the entire room erupted in laughter. For certainly, I just told a very enjoyable joke. Story 10. Used to travel for a glamping company, Glamour Camping, where we would set up huge canvas tents for fancy weddings and parties. We woke up real early one morning to a bunch of calls from some rich LA socialite about how the tents were wet. No other explanation. We rushed over and it turns out she had no idea what the concept of condensation in the morning was. "I can't control nature, sorry lady, you're not getting your deposit back." Story 11. Rishi Sunak. British Prime Minister, for the moment is stinking rich and grew up in a pretty affluent family. Went to a leading private school, Winchester and Oxford. Doing the interview rounds in the current election campaign, he was pressed by an interviewer about whether his family had ever had to give anything up. After much umming and ahhing, the only thing he could come up with was Sky TV, a British satellite TV service. He was lampooned for days about that one. He really is a colossal. Story 12. The I wanna say 12 or 13-year-old son of one of my clients literally expressed confusion to me when I asked them where I could get more paper towels from when they ran out in the washroom of his parents' however many million-dollar yacht. He said something like, "It's always there. What do you mean?" He was so disconnected from the process of, I guess, cleaning and restocking that he just thought that stuff would always be there and never run out. LOL. The look of genuine confusion on his face was just something else. That's not the first time I experienced that either. Talking to the kids of extremely wealthy people is always a trip. Story 13. I was an assistant making just over $50K a year, and I heard someone on the board of directors say, "Of course he mayor of a city stole the money. You can't live on $90K a year." Story 14. There was a guy who recently gave all his money away and lived on the streets to prove that anyone could earn millions. Then his father died and left him millions. He then stopped living on the streets and claimed to have proved his point. Edit spelling. Story 15. It's just so easy to just drop a grand at Target, you know? My Starbucks coworker in Calabasas Kardashian land, after he spent $9.83 on toys for his 4-year-old nephew's birthday. I don't know why he worked at Starbucks except maybe his rich family finally forced him to get a job. Story 16. I was a live-in super of a BLDG in Boston. The BLDG was 43 units, 40 were college kids. One year a young girl moved in next to me. 3 months later her electricity was shut off. She started pounding on my door demanding that I turn her electricity back on. I checked her circuit breakers. They were fine. Went into her app, immediately noticed the pile of electric company mail on her table, with big red letters last warning. Me. You didn't tell the electric company that you were the new tenant. Tenant. What's the difference? Why do they need to know it's me? Me. They need to send you a bill for electricity usage, tenant. Now I know you're messing with me. You don't pay for electricity. She moved out 2 days later of embarrassment, her parents having to pay for breaking the lease. She couldn't look at me for those 2 days. Story 17. At a high-end kids' clothing resale store called Once Upon a Child. The store only buys Nike, Adidas, or other well-known brand name kids' clothes. And only kids' clothes. Everything must be new or barely worn, or they won't buy it. Usually when you bring in a bunch of stuff for them to buy, they'll only buy 10 of what you bring in. I once saw them say no to a beautiful custom-made dress that an Indian couple had spent $300 on for their only child daughter. The reason was that it wasn't a brand name. So, at that store, some mom was selling a bunch of clothes and finding out what the store was taking and for how much. Her 8-year-old had wandered off into the store and came back with something she wanted to buy. Mom, no sweetie, we don't shop here. We only come here so poor people have nice things to buy. Story 18. I love the Dairy Girls. And I asked my husband to watch it with me again because I found it really funny. After watching the first episode with him, he said, "It is funny, but I can't relate to their problems with money and food." Story 19. I've known quite a few people to not realize the benefit they received by just getting a house, car, and cost of a degree, sometimes including advanced from their parents. Much easier to budget when those items are removed from the equation. Even more so when you can get some income from the house. Story 20. A rich person once said to me, "Why don't you just buy a second house for your vacation getaways?" As if owning one house wasn't already a huge financial stretch. Story 21. Rich friend. Just take Friday off work and fly out to visit me this weekend. I know it's last minute, but I'm sure there's seats available. Me. I don't think I can make this weekend. Rich friend. Oh yeah, I looked and saw it was only coach available. Don't be embarrassed. I don't blame you for not wanting to sit next to them. Me thinking, does this guy truly think that's why? Lol. I just earn average money. Story 22. I occasionally drive minibuses for a private school in the UK. Have overheard some very privileged conversations from the students, but one that sticks out is a tutor on the bus asked a student what he says when other students make comments about the very expensive watches he wears to school. To which he said, his response is, "My dad has the same 24 hours as your dad." He then proceeded to go on about how his dad inherited a massive entertainment chain and various hugely successful companies from his grandfather. Story 23. Company event, where people with investment properties told us that you just need to save hard to get that deposit. Just don't go out to dinner with your spouse as much. Or just go to the pub every other Friday. Yeah, so reducing restaurant dinners from 0 to 0 and the pub tab from 0 to 0. Still broke. My colleague left the Zoom midway through. If it was in person, he would have broken the door on the way out or came across the conference table at them. Story 24. This girl got genuinely angry and offended when people suggested she could take public transportation to the airport instead of paying for a 50 Uber. She posted on social media about it. Edit. The bus they suggested is very convenient and goes directly from our college to the airport, so it's not like she'd have to drag her luggage from bus line to bus line. Story 25. IMA type 1 diabetic and medical costs are insane without insurance. This happened in 2012 when the ACA bill was going through Congress. My boss was against it, and I told him how getting on insurance would help me. He grimaced and said, "That is your responsibility. You should get a job." I worked for him and he made sure to not provide benefits for the employees. Story 26. My friend has a charity, and these wealthy folks took him out to dinner to talk about the work he does. When it came down to making a donation of any amount, they were hesitant on whether to give. The bill for dinner came to the table and it was like $1,500 and they just dropped their Amex card like it was no big deal. Story 27. Doctor told me to work with my personal trainer to figure out a routine that wouldn't make my chronic autoimmune disorder worse. I asked if he was going to cover the cost of a personal trainer out of his own pocket. BC insurance sure as won't cover it. And I've never been able to hold a job in my entire adult life because of said chronic autoimmune disorder. Dude was shocked. Poor people exist, and one was in his office. Story 28. I was talking to a very rich lady we had just videotaped. She was a board of director at one of the largest oil companies on the planet. She told me she used to summer in Prague. I told her I used to summer in school. I thought that was a damn funny line, but it didn't even register to her. She was just confused on how that had anything to do with what she said. Story 29. Owner of the company I used to work for was a car guy. His daily driver was a giant, fully kitted out Chevy Tahoe that he rarely drove more than just himself in, and he also owned a Ferrari, one or two Mercedes, and a Jaguar, I think. Specific models I don't know, I just know they were pricey. One day after I had worked there for a couple years, he came to our office in NorCal and tossed me the fob to his Tahoe and said, "I need you to drive this down to Paso Robles, our office on the Central Coast, about a 5-hour drive, where he is based out of." When I asked how I would get home, he said he would make sure I get taken care of. When I asked how he would get back home, he said, "My Ferrari that I'm picking up from the shop." Later in the day, I asked him to show me where his windshield wiper controls were since rain was expected during my drive. He said it's all automatic, and when I asked how that works, he goes, "How old is your car?" Very nice guy that gave out generous bonuses every year, but he was pretty out of touch with us normies. Story 30. When we met in our friend group, the rich friend showed us his new expensive winter jacket for $500. And from time to time, he goes on a shopping haul with his rich dad where he spends 1 to 2K. One time we confronted him about his bragging and asked him if he didn't think that his spending for clothes is quite a lot. His answer, "Well, I know some people who spend more, and I know some people who spend less. So, I think I am average statistics 101. Story 31. How do you only have one dishwasher? Imagine their shock when I told them the apartment that I had just moved out of, that I lived in for 14 years, didn't have one at all. Story 32. I did some medical volunteer work in Haiti post-earthquake. Stayed on a Christian missionary compound because the clinic I worked at was supported by the mission. At dinner, I was talking about the bathroom at the clinic, basically an outhouse, and how instead of toilet paper, there was a bucket with torn-up book pages. The only reaction I got was a gasp followed by, "I cannot believe they treat books that way." I was speechless. Like, if that's what you took away from that, I cannot help you. Story 33. When I was growing up, we didn't have Sky TV. Sunak. 4th July can't come soon enough. Paris Hilton, not knowing cut flowers die because hers were replaced every day. Story 34. My sister's ex was born into a rich family and was so out of touch it was unreal. He was the poster child for spoiled white bro. He was racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and downright rude. His parents found him a fancy job making very good money, so he immediately threw it in my face that I'm lazy and stupid for not finding better jobs. I have a disability and it's incredibly difficult to find work. He told me, "If you don't like the job market in this country, leave." Easy for a rich, spoiled brat to say when mommy and daddy's money can pay for your cruises around the world while I'm struggling just to find my next meal. I'm glad my sister dumped his. Story 35. Rich kid who is a super nice guy wanted to go drinking with my buddy. My buddy said he didn't have any money. The rich kid said, "No problem. Well, stop at a bank machine on the way there." The concept of having no money didn't even register. The rich kid thought that my buddy just didn't have any money in his wallet. Story 36. I wouldn't consider this out of touch, but I was definitely amazed. Several years ago, I worked at a retail store that sold a lot of different items. I was on the cashier one Friday afternoon when 3 young women early 20s walked in decked out in luxury brands. They bought a suitcase and several other random items that totaled almost $400. Once I announced the total price, one of them pulled out 4 Benjamins like she was pulling out issues and handed them to me without looking. I asked if they were going on a trip. One of them answered, "No, we got sick of carrying our stuff." I mean, I get tired carrying stuff too. But to buy a whole suitcase and more just because they were tired was crazy to see. Story 37. During a dinner party, we started talking about our experiences in high school. I mentioned the diversity of my large 6A school and that almost half the student population was on free or reduced lunch. A woman who had grown up privileged in the San Francisco area absolutely burst out laughing and thought I was joking. She said free or reduced lunch. Why? What, they couldn't afford food? It got real quiet and real awkward when I explained, yes, that's exactly what happens in public school. She had only attended private school kindergarten through grad school. Story 38. Look, if you're that stressed, you should just do what I've been doing recently. Every 2 months, I go on a Disney cruise. They're awesome. Sometimes I go even more. Story 39. When our multimillionaire CEO made us say thank you for the napkins provided in our staff meeting BC, someone else in the company bought us pizza, and MGMT was kind enough to furnish the napkins. Story 40. I've had 2 rich friends separate times defend their Republican political candidates for wanting to get rid of Social Security. My accountant has been telling me for years to not count on Social Security being around in the future, and to invest elsewhere to prepare for retirement. People just need to listen to their accountants and plan. When I explained that many Americans live paycheck to paycheck, they both sort of shrugged like it wasn't their concern. Story 41. My old boss was verbally criticizing her new son-in-law and said, "He won't be any kind of decent husband. He only makes X an hour at his lousy job." My boss clearly forgot that I was making less than that. Story 42. I used to teach at a very expensive private school. This school went all the way through from kindergarten to high school. I had to give some students, who were about 9 years old, a ride in my car one time. A spoilt set of twins, in particular, couldn't understand why my car was so old and poor-looking. Adults are apparently supposed to have new expensive cars. My dad is an adult and he drives a Rolls-Royce. He gets a new car every year. You should get a new car too. Why don't you buy a new car? When I tried to explain that I was still in my first year of teaching and had only finished uni last year so didn't really have money yet, the response was, "But our dad has always had new cars, even when he was at university." On another occasion, one of them smashed her brand new iPhone on purpose to prove to other students her dad would buy her a new one. Story 43. Me and my ex were struggling financially when we first got married. I made enough to pay the bills, but there was nothing extra. She decided to enroll in school, and when she was filling out the FAFSA for financial aid, she asked me what my adjusted gross income was for the previous year. I have always done my own taxes, but at the time always threw the paperwork away when I was done, so I had no idea what it was. Our friend who was at our house at the time came from a very wealthy family who owned a hotel chain, had government contracts, etc. Without a second thought, he said, "Just call your accountant, they'll have it." He was baffled by the fact that having a personal accountant isn't something everyone has. Blew his mind. Story 44. When I nannied for a tech family, my boss was late on paying me and offered to pay me in Bitcoin instead. Like, if you think you're short on cash, what makes you think I want your fake internet dollars that cannot pay my rent? Story 45. Gwyneth Paltrow, talking about how her lifestyle brand Goop caters to the common woman with items including the $5.95 Zio hoodie, $6.25 ZB cardigan, $7.20 Zio V-neck top, and 66 egg-shaped vagina jade rock. Story 46. My coworker argued with me when I told him 20,000 would be life-changing for me and my family because it wouldn't be life-changing for his. I think he thinks everybody has a rich dad that gives them money. I work at this job literally to survive, and he works there because his dad told him he needed to get a job to keep getting his allowance. Story 47. Guy I went to college with. He's actually a really good friend, but he has zero idea how the real world works. His bought him this decked-out 1,000,000 mansion of a house and sold it to him on a personal loan without interest for $300,000. I called him on that when he said his family wasn't really that rich. It was just good timing. I really do like the guy, honestly, but holy, I wanted to strangle him in that moment. Story 48. I was telling a cute girl I met at a friend's birthday about a boom I was reading the Zanzibar chest. It was about a British journalist whose father was some minor colonial official. The journalist traveled extensively as part of his dad's work and his own. I mentioned wanting to travel to less popular destinations, always wanted to go to Mongolia. My grandfather got lost in the desert there once, and it was a wild story. Her response was that I should just enjoy my life and go. I know lots of people who travel a lot, so the advice was not that outlandish bit. I mentioned family I was taking care of, things I needed to save for, and not having flexibility at work. It became a point of contention like, no, you just have to say it and go. Your family will understand. My grandfather had late-stage Alzheimer's and we were taking care of him at home. He didn't know my name, much less understand things. Story 49. I've never experienced it personally, but I've heard several stories about rich people who flat out refuse to respond to anything said or asked by cashiers, repair people, drivers, etc., on the grounds that they don't talk to the help. Story 50. $350,000 a year is not enough to live. This was my canker sore of an uncle-in-law 3 years ago complaining that if he's not making close to $1 million a year, he can't live, as it won't cover the basics. He also lacked the self-awareness to realize he's the only person on his payroll making over $100,000 a year. If he can't make it on $350K a year, then what does he think his employees do? Story 51. I thought the governmental advice in early 2020 for what you should do if someone in the household got sick with COVID was incredibly tone-deaf. I don't know if higher-level governmental appointees and functionaries are rich, but they're certainly comfortably well off. Advising that an ill household member should be put into their own bedroom with preferably their own bathroom was reasonable from the point of view of isolation, but made a mighty bold assumption that a lot of people had that kind of extra real estate. I mean, that excluded people living in a studio or 1BR apartment. people in apartments or houses with a bunch of roommates, or family households including parents and/or kids that had moved in for any of a whole host of reasons. Once you've got folks hot bunking it on the couch, extra bedrooms and bathrooms ain't in it. Mind you, I am now retired, but was a primary care doc in a rural town who avidly supported masking and vaccinations. It's just that advising this was so out of touch with the day-to-day lives of average Americans, it just blew my mind. Story 52. A really rich kid I worked with, well, he was like maybe 25 or 26, was out to dinner with us on a work event. He ordered a bottle of wine from the sommelier, and the sommelier indicated he no longer had that vintage, but he had a similar vintage. He also explained, politely, the cost delta. The first bottle was going to be $7.50, and the new bottle would be $8.25. Rich kid looks around the table and asks, "Is that a lot?" Our boss just said, "Not if you're buying. But if I'm buying, you better pick something else." I've told this story before on Reddit, but it's still one of my favorite examples. Story 53. I can't remember his actual words, and this idea came from lots of various rich people, that somehow the education level of the Midwest is just fundamentally different than that of the coasts. That Midwesterners are just a slow, backward people. Story 54. I taught high school math at a private school for wealthy kids. The lesson was about compound interest and how it's calculated. A student raised their hand and asked, "Why should we know this?" Naive me answered that you need to know when you get a loan to buy a car or mortgage for a house. They looked baffled and asked me why I wouldn't pay for it in cash like the last Mercedes-Benz I bought. I couldn't reply after that. Story 55. My family only has a small yacht, as the follow-up to only because poor. Honorable mentions: I should know which years Indiana Jones came out because my dad produced them. My dad bought me an apartment in one of most expensive cities in the world that sits empty, so I have a place to stay when I visit. Choosing which uni to go to based on which has the nicest piano for me to play. What did I do over break? I stayed in a villa on the French Riviera for 2 months. My millionaire boyfriend is paying my tuition. Story 56. Once had a college-age coworker explain to a bunch of us in EMS, try to explain that his family wasn't that rich, because they only have a beach house, not a summer house, and then explained the difference between the two. Another coworker then went to pull up his apartment complex and pointed out the trailer park next door. Rich coworker then remarked that it must be nice to live next to a storage facility, referring to the trailer park. He didn't believe us when we explained that people lived in those trailers. He thought that was only something that happened on reality TV shows. We all hoped that inner-city EMS would help bring him back down to earth, but it had no effect. Story 57. In law school, we had obviously a class about constitutional law. One topic was voter registration and IDs, and how there were some racially motivated reasons for things like Jim Crow laws and so on. One of the cases discussed the use of family Bibles as a means of ID in situations where people didn't have a hospital-issued birth certificate. One girl made a point to raise her hand and say that was so stupid. Why wouldn't you get a birth certificate at the hospital? And when the teacher tried to explain that this also applied to destitute folks in BFE in the 50s, she just didn't get it. She also got real over how theft of food for a starving family is still a crime and should still be punished. Oh, and she lost her ever-loving mind when a Jewish classmate referred to Ash Wednesday as having some schmutz on your forehead on her personal Facebook. Like she tried to get the girl kicked out of student government. I've never met someone so entitled, so out of touch, and yet so enraged. It was weird. I don't miss law school even a little. Story 58. This from the UK's current PM, so we'd realize that, as someone worth more than our king, he can resonate with those he represents struggling in poverty. He was asked if he had ever gone without something by an interviewer. All sorts of things, like lots of people. There'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have. Famously, Sky TV, so that was something that we never had growing up, actually. Story 59. Last year, at an elite university, by now I had already gotten used to outlandish things studying with the children of royalty, politician, CEOs of household brands. It's really an entirely different track they're on compared to the rest of us. Me, on the other hand, my dad is a dosser, and I went through uni with what can only be described as poverty. One day, studying in the library with the kid of wealthy landowners, she makes the casual claim of how proud she is of us by funding ourselves through uni. A little confused by this, I ask what does she mean as I work full-time and she lives off her trust fund. She clarified she made such a claim because she was choosing to spend her trust fund on her law degree, which is the same as me choosing to work full-time to pay for my law degree, whereas everyone else was being made to go by their parents. Story 60. Back in 2006, I was working at a movie theater. Guy gets a large drink and popcorn. Comes out to like 20. He exclaims how expensive that is, which is true, before declaring how glad he is to make 52 hour and handing me his card. I was 17 and making 6. 25-hour at the time. Story 61. About 10 years ago, I was at one of the lowest points of my life. I had lost everything due to drugs and alcohol. Kids, wife, house, job, all gone. I went to visit a friend of mine who was rich. He is a multimillionaire, but he lives in California. While his dollar doesn't go as far as it might in more affordable places, he has a very comfortable life. His home is located in the foothills of a town where you must make six figures just to afford a refrigerator box. Anyway, I was hanging out with him on his deck, enjoying a fat spleef in the view. At some point, he says, "Dude, I just can't wait until I make it." I'm thinking like, bro, you know my situation. I have no home, no job, I'm on food stamps. And you decide to drop a comment so tone-deaf, it shows how empathetic you actually are. I left his house and never contacted him again. Story 62. When McDonald's put out an employee budget, you know, the 100 for car insurance or the 20 in medical. Story 63. Heard about this. A man was watching TV with his GF, a show about third world kids. They were refilling their water bottles from a rather nasty-looking river. This girl said, "Why do they do that instead of going home and filling with tap water?" Story 64. I know actual rich people not portrayed on TV rich, and most of them are pretty well-grounded everyday people. You wouldn't know they were rich by just hanging out with them. But every now and then, they don't realize that a few $1,000s makes a big difference to us not as well off. Story 65. Worked at a warehouse picking job. They didn't like that we conversed with each other while we passed and such. Owner had us gather and said we should be grateful we weren't working in the sewers somewhere, as if that was all we could aspire to do outside working there. Story 66. My friend who grew up not having to worry about money once said, "Oh, I don't really eat leftovers." I told him that was one of the most entitled things I ever heard. Lowell, I wouldn't even say he's rich, but it's definitely a different world not having to consider money all the time. Story 67. Is there a bathroom here for just customers and not employees? Old white woman who saw a young Hispanic employee leaving said, "Bathroom. Oh, and we hadn't opened yet." Story 68. Honestly, the most out-of-touch thing that rich people say are a result of not acknowledging that they are indeed rich. Too many people see themselves as the victim of those who are even richer. Story 69. Me, how can you justify paying us an exact median wage when the cost of living in Denver is far from median? VP of Comcast. I was on food stamps once and now look at me. You just have to work hard. Me, I was told that about college too. 70K in debt making slightly above min wage. VP, I think you just have a bad attitude. The "OL pull yourself up by the bootstraps" argument. Story 70. Guy I worked with once literally couldn't comprehend the fact that I've never been on an airplane. It was like I told a normal person I've never been in a car before. Story 71. Just booked the trip. I was talking to my boss's wife about wanting to visit Switzerland. Yeah, I don't have it like that. She has Susan from Seinfeld money. She assumes everyone else must. Story 72. Anything food-related. Complaining that regular people waste money on takeout when they should be buying rice chicken thighs because they did that once fed 10 people for 20. Meanwhile, they drop hundreds on groceries restaurants. This should have been a rant. Story 73. Had a person in my office who we all joke about is like a distilled pure boomer. He got talking about Hurricane Katrina for some reason, talking about how stupid everyone was for not evacuating. I told him many of the people in NLA didn't have the means to get out even if they wanted to. He said, "I know times get tough, but sometimes you just have to crack open that savings account." I was dumbfounded. To be so out of touch that you think the people stuck down in the Ninth Ward had a stash of money they were just sitting on. Story 74. My cousin married a rich guy when she was 21, and she also grew up pretty well off. I was 22 and just got married, and she asked us why we would rent a crappy apartment when a house is so much better. Had to explain that not everyone can afford a home in their early 20s, and especially not a 3 mil home like her and her husband owned outright. Then she rolled her eyes and said, "Well, if you're both working, then you should be able to buy a home." We did end up buying a home the next year, but it was a small starter home that we bought for 150K. And then she said she didn't get why we didn't build a new home that wasn't used. Story 75. Advice here on Reddit from one of its thousands of rich white California liberals: just move to Europe. In response to complaints about declining quality of life in the US. As if we can all just up and do that, like Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt did with daughter Gloria. It's like suggesting to a homeless person to buy a home. Problem solved. Story 76. Where is your beach house? I was at a cocktail party at a beachfront house on Isle of Palms, SC. Everyone was in private equity, Manhattan-based. Was chatting with someone and they asked me where my beachfront home was. I was a 25-year-old associate with 2 years of experience making about $75,000, but I was supposed to own a multi-million-dollar beachfront property. I guess they just assume property is so cheap in SC everyone owns a beach house. Story 77. I had a friend in high school genuinely confused as to why I needed a new job after quitting my last one. He told me jobs in high school are just for fun, because our parents pay for everything. I had to explain to him that my parents didn't pay for my car, insurance, gas, etc. Story 78. The owner of my company in Texas couldn't believe that everyone in our department had not been on an Alaskan vacation before. This same owner had me draw up floor plans for his new house, and it had an entire room dedicated to Christmas decorations that stayed up year-round because his wife liked Christmas so much. Said Christmas room also had a Christmas closet.